The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked shut around my wrists, sharp and precise. Red and blue police lights washed over the Victorian estate I had spent 4 years restoring. Through the rain-streaked window of the cruiser, I saw my 32-year-old brother Justin standing on the porch. He wore a smug, self-righteous smile, watching me being led away for a crime I didn't commit. I didn't panic. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't beg the arresting officers for mercy. I didn't cry in the back of the police cruiser as we drove away from the property I had painstakingly rebuilt. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was entirely clinical. Sitting in the concrete holding cell at the precinct, with the damp chills seeping through my clothes, I rubbed my eyes trying to summon a feeling of betrayal or regret, but there was only razor-sharp clarity. This wasn't an emotional breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and it was time to close the ledger. For 28 years, I had functioned as the silent, unacknowledged investor in my parents' twisted version of a family. They demanded absolute obedience, and I blindly footed the bill. Many people observing this from the outside might wonder why a successful architect, a woman fully capable of designing skyscrapers and managing multi-million-dollar commercial projects, would let her own parents' brother treat her like an endless, interest-free line of credit. Psychologists have a term for this specific type of conditioning. They call it learned helplessness. They had convinced me that the house was tied to a complex, multi-generational trust that I couldn't legally access or control until I was 40, effectively turning my own home into a gilded cage where I was merely a tenant. It functions as the invisible chain of the survivor. When you are systematically conditioned from early childhood to believe that your only intrinsic value is what you can financially or practically provide for others, you build a psychological prison without any physical bars. You stay inside that enclosure because you genuinely think the cold, unforgiving walls of their conditional affection are the absolute only shelter you will ever have. You convince yourself that the crushing, suffocating weight of their constant demands is just the natural structural load of love. But sitting alone in that sterile holding cell, the illusion completely shattered. I realized their love had never been a relationship, it had been a subscription service, and I was instantly canceling the renewal. My retaliation began at exactly 11:51 at night. I didn't ask the guards why this was happening, I just asked for my legal phone call. I immediately dialed my architecture firm's emergency operational line. I instructed my managing partner to completely lock down all active project files, freeze our secure client portals, and encrypt every digital blueprint connected to my name or the firm's accounts. By 12:03 in the morning, my entire professional portfolio and all associated assets were entirely sealed off from Justin's predatory reach. Next, I called Marcus Thorne. Marcus wasn't a sympathetic family friend or a gentle mediator. He was a probate and asset attorney with a terrifying reputation for being absolutely ruthless in trust litigation. When he answered the phone, I didn't offer a tearful explanation of the night's events. I simply gave him the address of the police precinct and told him my family had just initiated a hostile takeover of my estate. I told him to prepare for total legal warfare. They had arrested me based on a fabricated fraud complaint, assuming the quiet, compliant daughter would fold under the pressure of handcuffs and intimidation. They weren't going to be shocked by what they had done to me. They were going to be shocked that I had stopped playing along. The entire conflict between us centered around an obscure, heavily guarded legal entity my parents referred to as the family fund. Growing up, my mother, Elizabeth, and my father, Thomas, had wielded this supposed fund like a sacred, untouchable inheritance. They claimed it was a generational wealth pool established by my grandparents to maintain the family's grand Victorian estate and to support our collective ongoing endeavors. They used this noble-sounding justification to siphon off a massive percentage of my income, the exact moment I launched my architecture firm. They framed it as a family tax, a mandatory financial contribution to ensure our shared legacy survived. But this grand legacy was nothing more than an elaborate, decaying architectural facade desperately hiding a crumbling, hollow foundation. Sitting across from Marcus in his downtown office the very next morning, the handcuffs long gone, I laid out the meticulous paper trail I had been quietly assembling for years. I am an architect. My entire profession is based on documenting everything down to the millimeter. Every invoice, every bank wire transfer, every property tax record was meticulously categorized in a secure digital vault they had no idea existed. I handed Marcus a thick stack of printed, color-coded spreadsheets. The data told a brutal, undeniable, and mathematically precise story. While my family was living a lavish, highly visible lifestyle funded by personal loans and dangerously extended credit lines, I was the sole individual actually injecting real capital into the estate. The new slate roof that cost $45,000 paid for entirely from my corporate business account. The structural reinforcement of the aging foundation and the upgraded electrical grid financed directly by my independent architectural commissions. The annual property taxes, which amounted to over $35,000 a year. I had paid every single cent of those assessments for the past 6 consecutive years. My parents hadn't contributed a single dollar to the property's maintenance since 2018. Justin hadn't contributed a dime in his entire 32 years of life. Instead, the financial documents showed them actively, relentlessly siphoning money out of the operational accounts I was filling. Elizabeth was booking first-class luxury European cruises under the guise of family wellness retreats that I was never once invited to attend. Thomas was covering his catastrophic stock market investments. Justin was using the so-called family maintenance money to lease high-end Italian sports cars he had no means of affording. They weren't just greedy relatives struggling to get by. They were strategic, calculated leeches. I showed Marcus the exact timestamp wire transfers that proved my hard-earned funds were going directly to pay off Justin's defaulted credit card debt. They filed a police report claiming I embezzled from the estate, but these documents mathematically proved I was the estate. I didn't feel the sting of familial betrayal. I felt the cold, calculating precision of an auditor who had just found a fatal discrepancy in a corporate ledger. They had orchestrated my arrest to cover their own tracks, striking first to label me a criminal so they could seize control of my company's remaining assets. But this wasn't revenge. This was simply accounting. While Marcus and I fortified my legal and financial positions behind closed doors, my family eagerly escalated the conflict to the highly visible court of public opinion. Elizabeth had always been an absolute master of narrative construction, and she wasted zero time launching a calculated, vicious smear campaign. By the end of the weekend, she had flooded her extensive social media channels with tearful, meticulously staged posts. She didn't outright call me a criminal online. She used a much more damaging tactic. She called me a tragedy. She painted a vivid, agonizing picture of a deeply troubled, overworked daughter who had finally suffered a severe, catastrophic mental breakdown due to the overwhelming stress of running an architecture business. She claimed my sudden arrest was actually a desperate, loving intervention, a heartbreaking family decision made solely to protect me from my own self-destructive behavior. The posts were dripping with perfectly manufactured, weaponized empathy. She begged her followers to pray for me, claiming they were doing absolutely everything in their power to get me the psychological help I desperately needed but tragically refused to accept. It was psychological gaslighting elevated to an absolute art form. She was systematically destroying my professional credibility and personal reputation while safely wrapping herself in the unassailable, protective cloak of a grieving, devoted mother. Meanwhile, Justin took a much more direct, aggressively transactional approach. Armed with Elizabeth's fabricated narrative of my total mental collapse, he began aggressively contacting my firm's high-end commercial clients. My architecture firm was currently managing several multi-million-dollar urban development projects, and Justin used my temporary, highly publicized absence to intentionally sow corporate panic. He ruthlessly called the lead developers, posing as a concerned, authorized family representative, and strongly suggested that my firm was completely financially unstable and operationally compromised. He even produced a forged power of attorney document claiming I was medically incapacitated to trick the lead developers into believing he had legal authority. He then smoothly offered to step in and transition their lucrative contracts to a rival architecture firm he happened to be secretly consulting for on the side. He was actively forcing my most valuable clients to choose sides, attempting to entirely starve me of my revenue streams before I could even set foot inside a courtroom. The resulting professional pressure was immense and suffocating. My phone constantly lit up with anxious, demanding emails from major investors threatening to immediately pull their project funding. It would have been incredibly easy to panic, to rush online and post a frantic, emotional defense, to scream the honest truth into the unforgiving void of the internet. But I didn't. I maintained total, absolute, impenetrable silence. I coldly instructed my managing partner to issue a single, brief corporate statement assuring all clients that the firm was operating at full, uninterrupted capacity, and that any rumors of instability were entirely baseless and legally actionable. I absolutely refused to engage with Elizabeth's theatrical weeping displays. Reacting emotionally would only feed her narrative that I was unstable. Instead, I let them talk. I let them arrogantly spin their intricate web of lies, knowing with mathematical certainty that every false public statement, every fabricated social media post, and every documented phone call Justin made to my clients was just more undeniable evidence for Marcus to meticulously catalog. They were vastly overplaying their hand, deeply intoxicated by the arrogant belief that I was too weak and broken to fight back. They fatally mistook my silence for surrender. But my silence wasn't submission. It was a highly strategic retreat to higher ground. Every time Elizabeth posted a weeping video, Marcus archived it. Every time Justin emailed a client, we logged it as tortious interference. Let them control the narrative today. I was preparing to control the verdict tomorrow. The personal, emotional drama of my family's betrayal evaporated instantly, replaced entirely by cold, high-stakes legal warfare. I authorized Marcus to launch a full, merciless, and exhaustive forensic audit of the so-called family fund. We immediately brought in a specialized team of independent corporate financial investigators, systematically stripping away decades of my parents' careful, deliberate financial obfuscation. The audit was not a simple routine review of monthly bank statements. It was a microscopic clinical examination of every single asset, every hidden liability, and every authorized signature associated with the estate over the past 10 years. We secured an emergency court order to compel the regional banks to release the complete, unredacted transfer histories and internal communications. I spent 72 straight hours locked inside a sterile downtown conference room with Marcus and two senior forensic accountants, tracing the complex flow of capital exactly like architects tracing the load-bearing walls of a severely compromised building structure. What we ultimately uncovered hidden in the data went far, far beyond simple familial greed or financial mismanagement. It breached the undeniable threshold of major organized felony fraud. My parents hadn't just lied to me about how the maintenance funds were being utilized. They had actively, systematically, and repeatedly forged my signature on federal financial documents. The auditors uncovered a hidden series of secondary loan agreements attached directly to the estate's title. Elizabeth and Thomas had secretly taken out 3 massive home equity lines of credit, totaling over $850,000, using the Victorian property as their personal collateral. But because my corporate income was the absolute only verifiable source of capital, keeping the estate afloat in the eyes of the bank, they required my explicit legal authorization to secure the loans. Instead of asking me, they had simply fabricated my consent. My signature had been expertly, identically forged on dozens of binding banking documents, which were then officially notarized by a longtime family friend who was clearly undeniably complicit in the criminal scheme. They had literally mortgaged my financial future to exclusively fund their lavish present. Justin's expensive sports cars, Elizabeth's frequent European vacations, Thomas's massive hidden gambling debts, all of it was directly financed by illegal, fraudulent debt taken out completely in my name. The realization hit me with the sharp, cold clarity of a freezing winter morning. They hadn't just expected me to passively support them, they had legally and intentionally shackled me to their inevitable financial ruin. Suddenly, the fraudulent police report they had filed against me made perfect, terrifying logical sense. The massive balloon payments on those three illegal equity loans were rapidly coming due. They were completely out of money, completely out of credit, and completely out of time. They desperately needed me locked in a jail cell and my business assets legally seized so they could rapidly liquidate my company to cover the massive $800,000 fraud they had committed. The tension inside the conference room was absolute and heavy. Marcus looked down at the stack of forged bank documents, a cold, predatory smile slowly forming on his face. This wasn't just a bitter civil dispute anymore. It was federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. We weren't just going to clear my professional name, we were going to dismantle them entirely. I nodded once, my pulse perfectly steady. There was no room left for familial hesitation or emotional weakness. I had been the silent investor for far too long. It was time to aggressively foreclose on the entire relationship. We possessed the undeniable financial evidence, but to ensure an absolute, irreversible legal victory, we needed the original physical property records. The regional bank held the digital copies of the forged equity loans, but the foundational documents of the estate, the physical, original paperwork that established the exact legal ownership parameters of the property were conspicuously missing from all public records. Elizabeth had always casually claimed those specific documents were tragically lost in a basement flood years ago. But I am an architect. I knew the Victorian house better than I knew my own reflection. I had spent 4 years restoring it, learning every structural quirk, every hidden load path, and every historical anomaly of its architecture. I knew with absolute certainty that Elizabeth was lying. I secured a court-ordered search warrant, and under the supervision of a local sheriff's deputy, I returned to the estate alongside Marcus and 2 licensed private investigators. This ensured that our entry was not just legally sanctioned, but completely protected from any claims of trespassing or property disturbance. My parents weren't home, having conveniently relocated to a luxury downtown hotel to avoid the stress of the legal proceedings, likely paying for their suite with the very last of my stolen credit. I walked straight through the grand marble entryway, completely ignoring the antique furnishings and expensive curated art. I headed purposefully and directly for the main library. During my initial restoration of the house, I had painstakingly studied the original architectural blueprints drafted back in 1892. The library featured exquisite floor-to-ceiling oak paneling and a massive stone fireplace, but the precise physical dimensions of the room had always bothered me. The interior measurements didn't mathematically align with the exterior structural footprint. There was a glaring, unexplained discrepancy of exactly 24 inches along the eastern wall. It was a nagging architectural anomaly that had haunted my subconscious for years. As a professional architect, I had digitally archived every measurement of that house, and those missing 24 inches had never mathematically reconciled with the exterior footprint. At the time, I had logically dismissed it as a minor drafting error by the original Victorian builders. Now, my perspective was entirely different. I directed the private investigators to the ornate wooden flooring situated directly beneath the eastern bookshelves. I instructed them to pull up the floorboards right along the seam in the oak. It took them 20 minutes with heavy steel pry bars to lift the thick, stubborn oak panels. Beneath the flooring, perfectly concealed in the dark negative space of the stone foundation, was a heavy, fireproof steel lockbox. The secret compartment. We quickly broke the heavy brass lock. Inside, preserved in absolutely immaculate condition, were the true original foundational documents of the estate. I pulled out a heavy yellowed parchment folder and opened it. The breath caught slightly in my throat, not from shock, but from the sheer staggering magnitude of the deception. It was the original, unamended deed to the property, signed and finalized the exact year I turned 18. The legal document clearly, unambiguously stated that the entire estate was completely, legally, and irrevocably transferred into a protected generation-skipping trust with me, Elara Miller, listed as the sole, absolute, and exclusive owner. The family fund was a complete fabricated fiction. It had never existed in any legal capacity. My grandparents hadn't left the property to my parents. They had intentionally bypassed them entirely, leaving it strictly to me, explicitly to protect the family asset from Thomas's well-known financial incompetence. My parents had deliberately hidden the true deed, fabricated the entire concept of the family fund, and spent the next decade manipulating me into paying massive taxes and structural maintenance on a house I already legally owned. They had illegally used my own property as collateral for their fraudulent loans, all while demanding my constant groveling gratitude for letting me live there. I handed the original deed to Marcus. The criminal twist was fully complete. They hadn't just stolen my money and my credit, they had literally stolen my sovereignty. The downtown courtroom was suffocatingly quiet when the preliminary hearing convened. Elizabeth wore a perfectly tailored, highly conservative navy suit, clutching a white tissue to impeccably play the role of the heartbroken, exhausted mother forced to discipline her unstable child. Justin sat closely beside her, radiating a thick aura of unearned, smug arrogance. They had arrived at the courthouse fully expecting a quick, quiet settlement, supremely confident that their aggressive social media smear campaign and client interference had completely broken my resolve. They genuinely thought I would surrender all my assets just to avoid further public embarrassment. They were catastrophically wrong. When it was Marcus's turn to present our formal defense against their fabricated fraud charges, he didn't bother calling emotional character witnesses. He didn't offer a passionate defense of my mental health. He simply coldly approached the judge's bench and submitted 3 devastating exhibits: the comprehensive forensic audit clearly showing the forged equity loans, the sworn, notarized statement from their own family friend admitting to faking the signatures, and finally, the original hidden deed recovered from the library floorboards. The judge, a notoriously severe woman with over 3 decades of experience in complex financial litigation, reviewed the submitted documents in total silence. Her expression systematically shifted from professional, bored detachment to absolute simmering judicial fury. She looked up at my parents, her gaze completely lethal. In less than 10 agonizing minutes, the entire decades-long power dynamic of my life was permanently, violently inverted. The judge instantly dismissed the fabricated criminal charges against me with extreme prejudice. She then turned her full, terrifying attention to my family, loudly outlining the overwhelming, undeniable evidence of systemic bank fraud, federal wire fraud, and grand theft. Citing the immediate threat of flight and the gravity of the falsified federal documents, she revoked their bail status entirely. She didn't just rule in my favor. She immediately struck her gavel and ordered the courtroom bailiffs to take Elizabeth, Thomas, and Justin into direct police custody pending formal federal criminal indictment. The physical transformation of my family was instantaneous and utterly pathetic. Elizabeth dropped her prop tissue, her carefully constructed aristocratic facade completely crumbling as genuine, raw panic finally set in. Justin stammered incoherently, looking wildly around the wood-paneled courtroom as if expecting some invisible servant to rush in and rescue him. Thomas simply went chalk pale, physically shrinking into his heavy leather chair. It is a fascinating, almost clinical psychological phenomenon to witness the exact moment a toxic, abusive hierarchy completely collapses. It perfectly exposes the illusion of power from an empty wallet. For years, my family had aggressively projected an aura of absolute authority and upper-class invincibility. They demanded constant respect, harshly dictated the rules of engagement, and looked down on anyone who didn't perfectly meet their impossible aesthetic standards. But their power wasn't real. It was entirely rented, financed exclusively by stolen capital, and sustained entirely by my silent, fearful compliance. When you finally strip away the stolen money and the fabricated status, people exactly like my parents don't just lose their material assets. They lose their entire psychological identity. They have absolutely no intrinsic value to fall back on, no genuine moral character to sustain them through adversity. They are merely empty, hollow vessels wearing very expensive clothes. As the armed bailiffs approached with heavy steel handcuffs, Justin finally looked directly at me. There was raw, naked desperation in his eyes, silently, pathetically begging for the sister he had spent his entire life stepping it on to somehow save him. I met his panicked gaze with perfect, unbreakable, ice cold silence. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I just sat there and watched them be physically escorted out of the courtroom, their unearned, fabricated status vanishing forever into the sterile, fluorescent lighting of the criminal justice system. The accounting was finally perfectly settled. Exactly 1 week later, I drove my car back up the long, familiar, tree lined driveway of the Victorian estate. The heavy iron gates opened smoothly, finally welcoming me to my own home. The sprawling property was finally truly mine, completely and permanently free of the toxic, suffocating presence that had haunted its historic halls for decades. I walked through the grand marble entryway, and the silence of the massive house was no longer oppressive. It was deeply, profoundly comforting. The expensive antique furniture remained exactly where it had always been, but the crushing, oppressive weight of my family's relentless expectations had been permanently evicted. I stood alone in the exact center of the library, right above the repaired floorboards where the secret compartment had been hidden, and I felt the strong, unbreakable structural integrity of my new life finally taking hold. The federal criminal charges against my family were proceeding quickly and without mercy. Facing multiple counts of federal fraud and massive, insurmountable restitution demands, their grim future was entirely out of my hands. I had formally and legally severed all contact, blocking their phone numbers and instructing Marcus to handle any and all necessary communication regarding the estate's transition. I didn't feel a lingering, desperate need for their tearful apologies or their frantic, fabricated explanations. I didn't need them to finally understand my worth. I've come to realize that holding on to deep anger is just another way of letting toxic people live in your head rent-free long after they've been evicted from your life. This victory wasn't a sudden burst of genius, but the result of years of quiet, meticulous planning. I had been building my exit strategy in the shadows, waiting for the exact moment their greed would finally force them into a mistake I could prove in court. Forgiveness isn't always a gift you give to the other person to repair a broken relationship. Sometimes it's the absolute only way to permanently set yourself free. It is the final, authorizing signature on the blueprint of your own independence. True freedom begins the exact moment you stop needing the permission, the validation, or the approval of the people who consistently hurt you in order to build a beautiful, sustainable life for yourself. I stepped out onto the back stone terrace, breathing in the crisp, clean afternoon air, completely ready to start designing my future on a solid, unshakable foundation that I had poured myself. If you've ever had to set a difficult, painful boundary with toxic people to save your own life and protect your peace, please hit that share button. Your story might just help someone else find the courage to do the exact same thing.